The 2002 version of the Australian Grand Prix is one of, if not the most memorable iteration of the race held down under. Let's go back in time and relive the unique story of the race, which had two separate podiums. As the season opener approached, Michael Schumacher and Ferrari were considered the favorites for the season. However, even though the F2002 looked fast in testing, the Italian team opted to compete in the first two races of the season with a revised version of the previous season's car due to concerns about its reliability. Yet, even in qualifying, the first signs that the championship battle again would not be a close one were evident. The Ferrari duo locked out the front row both with laps 4/10 faster than their closest rivals, despite having arrived in Melbourne with the F2001B. This gap wouldn't mean much if they failed to maintain their lead at the start though, particularly on a track where overtaking was so difficult. The cars took their places after the formation lap. 5 red lights lit up one by one, then went out, and the race started. Many of you may have seen this start before. Ralf Schumacher made a good start and passed his brother in the first few meters. As the pack approached the first corner, Ralf was caught off guard by Barrichello's change of line and earlier braking, and his car literally took off after the contact. There was chaos at the back of the grid as well, which was further exacerbated by the accident at the front. The race director's decision drew mixed reactions here as well, as after the carnage at the start, in which 8 cars failed to complete the first lap, Charlie Whiting opted to deploy the safety car rather than suspend the race. The order was, predictably, completely mixed up. David Coulthard was now in the lead, followed by Jarno Trulli, Juan Pablo Montoya and Michael Schumacher. When the race restarted, Montoya made a move around the outside on Trulli at turn 3, but he slid off the track after driving over some radiator cooling fluid, which had been leaking from Jenson Button's car. This handed third place to the 4-time world champion. Coulthard, meanwhile, had extended his lead to 4.5 seconds after only 3 laps. It seemed like we were about to see the notorious Trulli train in this race once more. Trulli, as we would see many times in the following years, was running second thanks to his strong qualifying performance and his ability to escape the chaos at the start, while severely slowing down those behind him. That is, until he lost control and crashed into the wall on lap 8. The safety car took to the track for the second time to remove the Renault, which had stopped right in the middle of the circuit. The leader Coulthard was just about to dictate the pace for the restart when he missed his braking point at the penultimate corner before even green flag racing was resumed. Distracted by an electrical problem, he forgot to downshift and suffered massive understeer that sent him spinning onto the grass. Schumacher, who a few laps earlier had seemed to have a tough task ahead of him for the win, suddenly found himself in the lead without even having to make a move. But as soon as the green flag waved, Montoya made a move for the lead and managed to stay ahead despite locking his tires. The fearless Colombian was considered by many to be Schumi's main rival for the championship before the start of the season. With Häkkinen retiring as well, he was seen as the next driver who would be the one to take on the German driver one-on-one. In fact, in the previous season, in only his second race in Formula 1, he'd clashed with Schumacher, again taking the lead with a bold move after a safety car period. That said, the car under him here at Albert Park wasn't good enough to allow him to resist Ferrari for long. Montoya tried to make things difficult and gave us a good battle for the lead, but he was overtaken by the Ferrari after 5 laps. Taking over the lead, Schumacher didn't look back for the next 41 laps and cruised to a comfortable win. The young Finn Kimi Räikkönen, who was making his McLaren debut, finished the race in 3rd place, achieving his first career podium. But the real story that made this race special was being written at the back by Minardi, one of the most well-liked teams not just on the grid, but Formula 1 history. Since their debut season in 1985, the Minardi team had won the hearts of fans and media alike with their ability to compete with much smaller budgets than their rivals by giving young drivers a chance and being easily accessible to the fans and media. The Italian team had been rescued from the brink of bankruptcy after the end of the 2000 season by Australian businessman Paul Stoddart, who bought the team for, as he put it, next to nothing. When he took over the team, there wasn't even a car. Most of the employees had left, and all they had was a wooden car model with a Renault engine stuck in the back. With only 45 days to go before the start of the 2001 season, they got to work and somehow managed to get the car to the first race and reach the finish line. The start of the 2002 season wasn't as arduous, of course. The team didn't have to be rebuilt from scratch, but the conditions were still quite difficult for them. When young racer and fellow Aussie Mark Webber met Stoddart at the US Grand Prix in September 01, he approached him about joining the team in 2002, but Minardi needed money. It appeared that the team might have to race paid drivers to stay afloat. And indeed, with a commitment from the Malaysian sponsors finally coming through, one of the seats in 2002 was occupied by Alex Young, who'd had little success in the junior categories. With some certainty about the team's financial fate and Australian Grand Prix organizer Ron Walker's insistence that he wanted an Aussie driver on the grid, it was finally verbally agreed that Mark Webber would race for the team, albeit only for the first 2 races of the season. After all, despite the Malaysian sponsors, the team's annual budget was only $28 million. Now, with an Australian on the grid for the first time since '94, the Australian Grand Prix was a home race for Minardi in almost every sense. The excitement of that became one of the focal points in the paddock, along with the fan events that had been going on all week. However, Stoddart was still unsure if they'd be able to start the race. He was concerned about the 107% rule, which had been introduced to prevent backmarker teams from starting the race in the case that they were so slow that they would pose danger and that it would adversely affect the race. Those who could finish the session with less than 7% within the pole sitter's lap in qualifying were eligible to start the race. So, failure to even line up on the grid in the first race of the season wouldn't only have been demotivating for the whole team, but it would have also seriously upset the sponsors. After Webber and Young's laps at the start of the session before the most competitive teams took to the circuit, Stoddart's prayers for rain weren't left unanswered. As the weather and track conditions gradually worsened, the laps that followed allowed them to stay comfortably within the required margin. So, Minardi did manage to get both cars into the race. It was doubly important that they were able to make it through to Sunday this time as well. Melbourne's Albert Park circuit had been the venue for the Australian Grand Prix since 1996 and hosted the opening race of the season since it joined the calendar. Season openers often saw more drivers than usual not finishing the race throughout history, but at Albert Park, a street circuit, this was particularly evident. The number of cars that saw the checkered flag was 10 or fewer in 4 of the 6 races held at the circuit before 2002. This was mainly due to the fact that the innovations introduced by the teams being tested for the first time in a race setting, resulting in more breakdowns. In the 2002 Australian Grand Prix, with only 14 cars emerging from the chaos of the first lap in one piece, it certainly looked like we were gonna see another race where just making it to the finish line would mean a significant result, especially for backmarker teams like Minardi. Of the 11 teams, Minardi was the only one to finish the previous season without a single point, but here both of their cars were left unscathed after the carnage at the opening lap. Still, it was unlikely that they'd be able to score points in this race, because back in 2002, points were only awarded for finishing in the top 6. And that small glimmer of hope was seemingly soon to be gone. On just the 3rd lap of the race, the team discovered that Webber's car had a serious differential problem for which there was no solution, and it seemed like the car would only be able to continue for another 5 to 10 laps. Nevertheless, the Australian continued to complete lap after lap, albeit slowly. Trulli's crash and Coulthard's eventual gearbox problem after his mistake meant that they were added to the already long list of retirees from the first lap. With further 2 cars having mechanical problems and 2 more cars being disqualified for failing to comply with race procedures, the number of cars continuing was down to just 8, with 25 laps still to go. On top of that, an ignition problem in Pedro de la Rosa's Jaguar caused a pit stop that lasted several minutes. He could only continue the race 5 laps behind the leader, leaving him completely out of the equation. Mark Webber suddenly found himself in 5th place, but nothing was over yet. Finishing the race would now mean points for the team, but it was no longer just about points for Minardi. It was virtually impossible for such an opportunity to arise again, and they had to think about the rest of the season. They had to finish the weekend with as many points as possible. Meanwhile, the problems were still not going away. When the Aussie driver stopped in front of the garage for his final pit stop, this time the fuel cap wouldn't open. It was only when one of the mechanics opened the cap with a screwdriver that the car could be refueled. And finally, after a 35-second pit stop, he returned to the track without losing position, but the gap to the Toyota behind him had narrowed considerably. Heading into the final 10 laps, the leaders were running laps in the 130 to 131s, while Webber, trying to get the car to the finish, could only manage lap times in the 137s. Toyota's Mika Salo was also upping the pace, just 16 seconds behind Webber and stealing 3 to 4 seconds a lap. At this point, Stoddart radioed Webber to tell him to do whatever it takes to hold that position. If they could keep the Toyota behind them now, 5th place could be worth $25 million depending on their finishing position in the team's championship, which was almost the team's annual budget. On the other hand, behind them was a team that had already had $1.5 billion poured into it by the Japanese car giant as they eyed an entry to the grid in 2002. With 4 laps to go, the Toyota managed to catch the Minardi, and Webber began to defend as if his life depended on it. But, looking at the pace difference, he only seemed to be delaying the inevitable. After holding Salo behind him for about 1.5 laps, with 2 laps to go, Salo made a move to the outside of Webber, who had covered the inside early in the straight, and just as Montoya had done earlier in the race, he lost control of the car running over the cooling fluid leak. Webber didn't put a foot wrong after that and finished in 5th place, 2 laps behind the leader. Paul Stoddart later said that teams like Minardi, who were fighting at the back, never kept champagne with them. There was normally no need for them to carry champagne after all. So he told the team's catering staff to borrow champagne from other teams after the race was over. But before they could even leave, the other teams were already marching to the Minardi garage with boxes of champagne. Stoddart recalled that after the race was completed, Schumacher, Barrichello and Jean Todt invited him and Mark Webber to the Ferrari garage following the podium ceremony, where they celebrated together. It was here that Michael Schumacher told him that he'd witnessed things here he'd never seen in a race before. Leading comfortably at the front, he thought the race was over in the last 3 laps because he could see from his car that everyone in the grandstands was standing and focused on Mark. He also noticed that while there were 1,000 fans in the podium ceremony area, there were tens of thousands gathered at the opposite end of the pit lane around the Minardi garage. Australian Grand Prix organizer Ron Walker then called Stoddart to take him to the podium. The Minardi boss repeatedly sought confirmation from Max Mosley and Bernie Ecclestone that this would not be a problem. And for the first time in Formula One history, a second podium ceremony was held at a Grand Prix. The spontaneous ceremony was held in front of thousands of fans with champagne and, as there was no trophy for them, plush kangaroo toys. Since the national anthem couldn't be played on this unplanned podium, the theme song of Qantas Airlines was played in the speakers. Webber's defense of 5th place was perhaps even more significant than they'd anticipated in terms of Minardi's position in the standings at the end of the season and even the fate of the team. As Stoddart had warned during the race, keeping Toyota behind them and finishing 5th at Melbourne meant that they beat a team that was their direct rivals in the championship. The team couldn't extend their points tally all season and was joined by Toyota and Arrows in the final standings. However, both of these teams had scored 2 points with 2 6th-place finishes, and as the best result is taken into account when points are tied, Minardi finished the season ahead of both of these teams in 9th place. Check out the video where I analyze what more Fernando Alonso, who stepped into Formula One with Minardi a season ago, could have achieved by making different choices in the opportunities that came his way throughout his career. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.